everyone. Welcome to episode 54 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today's main topic is going to be around primer sessions, and I think that is going to kind of lead us into a more general discussion around microcycle or training week design. Probably talk about the DUP and maybe some more, updated approaches compared to, some of the original DUP type of approaches. So I think there'll be a lot of good stuff beyond just kind of this specific topic of primer sessions. Another piece of housekeeping, or our first piece of housekeeping, is how about those FAU Owls?
Absolute heartbreaking loss.
Heartbreak City, man.
Yeah, that was, I think it was the first FAU sporting event. We got a few of us together from the lab and absolute tearjerker there at the end.
Yeah, it's hard to be upset when you only watch the March Madness games and you literally used to work in the same building that they played. So can't complain too much. But pretty cool to see FAU get that deep in the tournament. Zach and I both went to Ohio State, and for the college football fans, there's a heartbreaking loss for the Buckeyes in the semifinals of this year's college football playoff.
Mm-hmm.
We both have master's degrees from FAU and are currently in a PhD program at FAU. And the Owls lost in the semifinals in heartbreaking fashion for college basketball. So it's hard to complain getting in the top four from our alma maters, but nonetheless, pretty heartbreaking. A more important piece of housekeeping news is we want to briefly mention, finally, we can announce the release date for a new product we have coming, which is Thursday, April 27th. We will be releasing Infinity programs. So much more to come about that, probably in future episodes and also across social media. But what I'll say is, just right off the bat, is it has been completely rebuilt from the ground up. So for those of you familiar with our individualized programming option, it is the next version of that. So version 3.0 of individualized programming is now Infinity programs. And don't get me wrong, there's still going to be limitations with the new system, but we have taken the old structure that was extremely successful and countless PRs across all the users, and just took all the feedback, all of the things we've kind of changed our minds on as well in the last couple of years, and just completely rebuilt it from the ground up. And we're really excited for it. So shout out to everyone that is in the individualized programming group right now. All that feedback has kind of led to this. And I think it's safe to say it took us a little bit longer than expected, just because we wanted to get it right. Again, there's still gonna be limitations, but we think it's a considerable leap forward, and we're really excited to talk more about it. If you are interested in Infinity programs, you can kind of mark that date on your calendar. If you sign up around the launch date, again, which is Thursday, April 27th, you'd be good to start your program by like the Monday after that. So you can kind of mark your calendar if you're in the market for a new program. Keep your eyes peeled for that. We will leave the first link in the description of this episode, a link to sign up to stay updated about that and make sure you're the first one to hear about it through email, and also make sure you get the best deal. So check out the description of this podcast, whether you're on YouTube or your podcast player of choice, and we'll be in touch through there. So the second link in there will be the link to sign up for the training takeaway newsletter. Gotten really, really good feedback on, I think we are on like the 16th newsletter, which is kind of crazy how quickly they've flown by. One thing that makes me feel really good about it is I am often going back to our previous newsletters to reference things. That's kind of the ultimate test for me when I feel good about work that I'm putting out, is when I look back at previous work to reference it when I'm doing something academically or doing something for a client or just reading, whatever the case may be, kind of looking back at our stuff, whether I made it or Zach made it. Same idea with like our nutritional periodization course. I don't mean to also plug that, but I've looked back at that multiple times per week since we released it, when I'm helping lifters with acute and long-term body weight maintenance stuff, which I don't know. It feels good because it's useful for me. So even if you guys all hate it, at least it's useful for me. But at least a few of you guys have mentioned that it has been useful. So we appreciate that. And I'm going to shut up now. Zach, you have anything to say, or can I lead you into primer sessions here?
No, man, I'm excited for Definity. It's crazy how many newsletters we've done. That honestly, I think that's really cool to kind of look back on it. There was kind of a change in content that we wanted to make and start putting some longer form stuff in terms of written content out there, and it's been cool to the feedback on this, and hopefully we can keep it going and keep making these entertaining, useful, etc.
Yeah, good stuff. We'll stop tooting our own horns now. And yeah, Zach, just probably kick off by defining primer sessions and some of the research, some of the limitations, and we'll take it from there. So
Sure.
it's all you, man.
Cool. So yeah, most recent newsletter was over the topic of primer sessions. So I guess to start with a definition, I think is probably useful to kind of briefly touch on. Primer sessions are kind of these low volume training bouts or training sessions that are designed not necessarily for the maximum stimulus within that session, but more so to kind of potentiate your performance for up to somewhere up to 48 hours after that session. So I was looking back at some of this stuff for when I was programming a taper for somebody recently. And I knew there was a review paper on this topic that I hadn't read in depth or hadn't got a chance to read in depth, and I wanted to go through that. And so that kind of sparked some of the ideas and things I wanted to discuss related to this newsletter. So there was a review paper by Harrison and colleagues that kind of goes through all of this evidence, investigating, what they call in the title resistance priming or primer sessions, whatever you want to call it, in its ability to improve neuromuscular performance kind of acutely. So obviously in the context of our listeners, the things we're kind of most interested in are going to be how can we utilize these primer sessions to benefit our performance for either a really high priority training session. In today's kind of strength programming landscape, you'll hear the words primary session thrown around to kind of indicate the session that's of the highest priority and where the performance we really want to come into that session feeling our best, minimal fatigue, so we can really push loads on that day. That's an example where these could be useful, but then also, like I said initially, in the context of tapering before a competition, I think that's kind of the two places this comes to mind. And so just to briefly touch on, what we describe in the newsletter, we like to differentiate these a little bit, but just to briefly touch on the main findings there. Primer sessions can kind of consist of two different approaches primarily. The one, one of them is exposing yourself to a heavy load, which is generally in the research is anywhere above 85% of 1RM. We'll talk about why that may not be the exact range we'd recommend for people listening to this podcast in a bit, but somewhere, 80 to 85% of 1RM and above, doing some training with those loads, or kind of like ballistic low to moderate load training. So, think about doing squats or jump squats with like 30% of your 1RM and training those with absolute maximal intended concentric velocity. Those are kind of the two archetypes of primer sessions that have been investigated in the research. And importantly, those are usually done for pretty low volumes. For the heavier stuff, somewhere in the 1 to 5 total reps per session range. And then some of the lower load stuff upwards on the rep count, but every set is still, very, very far from failure. So those are kind of how they've been investigated. The one limitation kind of for the context that we care about most applying this stuff to for our listeners is that a lot of the outcomes that have been investigated in terms of these acute performance improvements are more of like velocity and power related outcomes. So things like, vertical jump height, counter movement jump height, sprint time, velocity with very, very low loads, things like that. Now, I think those can be somewhat informative of just kind of overall neuromuscular performance, which would also influence strength and the things that we care most about. Obviously, those aren't directly strength outcomes, so we want to be careful in the way that we're extrapolating those. That said, there is some data on strength as well that seems to benefit from these types of primer sessions somewhere in the 6 to 24 hour range. um, showing that those do also seem to improve strength. So, kind of putting that stuff all together, these low volume bouts of training can potentiate performance. A variety of different measurements for somewhere between 6 to 48 hours, and um, that seems to be at least enough evidence for us to kind of integrate our practical experience here when we're actually looking to program these things and actually put them in the implementation of the training of more of the people that we're talking to, which are going to be predominantly strength athletes and particularly powerlifters. And so I guess the place I'd want to start for us kind of to go back and forth here, Josh, is the unfortunate part of this research is that the actual strength data is just very limited. There's only, I would count 3 studies that I really consider really solidly investigating strength outcomes, and even one of those is the only one that actually measures an RM test of any kind, and in particular is a 3RM. So we're definitely extrapolating a little bit in terms of the strength data and how this stuff would be organized. So with that being said, we have to kind of integrate some of our experience. And I think Josh and I both have been playing around with this stuff, particularly in the context of tapers, for a really long time. There was some pretty, some of the early data on this was pretty intriguing as kind of a cap off to a taper is the way that I kind of view it. So I'd say for a long time I've been implementing the low to moderate load ballistic training prior to competition, somewhere 24 to 48 hours out, pretty much in all my clients for, I don't know, maybe a year, 2 years, something like that. And just anecdotally, it's always seemed to result in clients feeling like just you have that pop on game days is really the most bro terminology I can describe. And that seems to be in line with what the research seems to suggest. But using that kind of experience, that's where the practical recommendations that we take from what has been investigated to the way that we would actually prescribe it to a client, I think is going to kind of change. And then also the different contextual applications between, okay, is this something I'm going to try to use within a typical microcycle to kind of potentiate that the heaviest session or the highest priority session, your primary day, whatever you want to call it, or am I going to use it prior to a taper? I think the applications there are slightly different. Ultimately, the thing from this evidence that I think is the most interesting that I would that potentially would change the way that I've implemented it in the past would be there does seem to be a little bit of like a principle of specificity kind of through line here a little bit in terms of what seems to be potentiated. Now, there is definitely limited evidence on this and we need more of it. But there is some studies that seem to suggest that, for example, there's one study that looks at trying to use 60% of 1RM versus 80% of 1RM roughly to potentiate the velocity, which is going to be a proxy of force production, with 80% of 1RM. 80% of 1RM seem to do better than 60% of 1RM in that case. So we could at least somewhat make an educated guess that including some exposure to a high load event is probably going to be better at potentiating high load performance than maybe some of the ballistic stuff. But I really believe, looking at this evidence overall, that there's no reason we can't combine them. And that would probably be the approach that I advocate moving forward, is going to be some sort of a blended approach. And this is where the actual prescription is pretty variable. And I think Josh and I have, some anecdotes that definitely align, and then some anecdotes that definitely contrast, and kind of how we've applied these concepts, and maybe how they are best applied to kind of minimize the risk to reward ratio and things like that. So I think that's ultimately where I kind of want to take this podcast. Is ultimately the data would suggest this is definitely something that's interesting to play around with. And I think, like Josh said earlier, kind of the DUP origins of this are something that I definitely find interesting. This is kind of that power day in a typical DUP model, kind of talking about how maybe we could best program that based on some of the more recent evidence. And I think that would be, kind of old historical evidence as well that this could be effective. And so
DUP is historical.
I mean, if you really think about it, like how long kind of undulated programming has existed.
Yeah,
That's been
none of this
really,
stuff is
yeah,
new by any means.
it's not new.
Yeah,
It's just like the modern, our advisor's application of it's a little bit more modern, I guess.
yeah,
The DUP,
yeah,
but anyway, yeah, I think there's anecdotal, our own experience, and evidential kind of all kind of point in this being potentially a strategy we can utilize to benefit performance, and then it just comes down to what are the factors we're actually integrating when we're writing something down on a piece of paper to give to a client to actually result in the effects that we want to see. So I guess with that in mind, I'll let you butt in. Anything I missed? Anything you want to touch on?
yeah. I mean, from a high level, like just take a step back and realize how cool that is. Ultimately, we typically think of a training bout as something that must be recovered from, but this potentiates performance in the acute sense. Um, it and that's just really kind of like a different perspective than, again, like in your strength training 101 lectures that you'll have. And how to leverage this on an individual level is kind of where I think it makes the most sense to go from here. And also there's a lot of moving parts within practice. Like you said, there's kind of two applications in our eyes for this. The first being um, kind of a primer session for a testing session or a competition, 1 to 2 days out from that. And then the second one being to kind of potentiate a primary session within a normal training week. Um, the former is pretty straightforward, and I have not found anybody that doesn't seem to benefit from it. I have found different configurations of these primer sessions to be better for different people and also the placement of them. Some folks seem to really jive with having them the day before. Some people do a little bit better with them 48 or even 72 hours out. Um, and it's a very, very low cost, right? Because at this point, we're tapering. We're not going to do a hard training session within 24, 48 hours of competition, at least for the vast majority of people. And at minimum, right, it gives the individual a chance to kind of warm up again, to not feel sluggish because they're not training. Also, I think you can sprinkle in some visualization there. So whenever I program these in a taper, I will like write in all caps, like, be sure to warm up properly and move these with intent, because I think there's something just from kind of warming up and getting in the position again that can promote recovery. And maybe there's kind of the cherry on top of this actual potentiation from these primer sessions. And again, how this looks within a taper and how this, yeah, how it's how an individual is going to respond is going to vary. Some folks, you don't want to be touching anything above 60%, whereas some other folks might benefit from, having a bench single at 90%. Um, and responses there can be pretty dramatically different. Um, and then to circle back to the latter case we were talking about within microcycle design, I think that's where things get a lot more interesting because there's more moving parts here, right? You don't want to spend a ton of time in the gym that is just for kind of an acute thing, right? So it might be beneficial to actually accrue some productive volume and potentially also feel that much better for your primary session coming up the next day or 2 days later, 3 days later, that sort of thing. Um, within DUP, you kind of have your strength day, your hypertrophy day, and your power day, and this would resemble the power day. Um, what would you say is was a typical prescription within kind of a traditional DUP approach? Would you say like 80%
I
singles,
think
80% doubles?
I think it kind of, yeah, I think it kind of changed over time. I think
Yeah,
initially it really was kind of that dynamic effort West Side kind of
yeah,
approach where you're training with velocities above like point 0.6 point 0.7 most of the time. But over time, I think kind of as specificity kind of came along, Bulgarian method, people started talking about that kind of stuff. I think it more became singles 80, singles 85% kind
yeah,
of an approach. Um, so yeah, I think it kind of changed, but that's something around there.
yeah. Um, so it's probably important to mention that based on the research itself, I think the best, again, truly just based on the research, the best recommendation would be to kind of follow that specificity line of thinking. And you'd probably be looking at 80 to 85% plus for these primer sessions. I pulled Zach back during the kind of editing process of this newsletter because in my opinion, I don't think within a microcycle I would do that very often of having someone touch above 85% on a day that's truly a primer day. Now, if they're benching 4 or 5 times a week and they have no issues kind of tolerating top singles on bench, yeah, that's a different story. But on average, most folks, if I'm kind of programming a primer session or just the easiest session, we're probably not touching above 80 to 85% very often. So that's why, again, we're kind of sprinkling in our practical observations and probably leaning a little bit conservative as well, given this is not individual advice. It's more for general recommendations within the newsletter for all the readers. But yeah, I mean, from a high level, ultimately, the microcycle design of this is just the easiest training day preceding the hardest and or the heaviest training day. And it's designed that way in order to maximize performance on that heaviest day, because that's kind of your anchor point for exposures to the heaviest loads throughout the week, and thus how performance is trending over time in order to analyze your response to training. So yeah, any threads you want to pull on there, Zach?
I don't know. It's one of those things where there's just so many ways you can go with it. Like, there's a couple interesting things in the paper of like, so I guess the first question I asked myself from like an individualization perspective is like, when would something like this be indicated? For example, like what is the difference between somebody who just needs 2 squat days a week that are normal? Like, I would say, one that's higher priority, one that's a little bit lower priority. What is going to make me pull the trigger on implementing one of these? Is that something we should do in all cases? Is it something there's a reason for? So that's kind of the first thing, is because somebody may read this and be like, oh, I could benefit my primary day performance. I'm going to go my next microcycle. If I currently squat 2 days a week and I'm making awesome progress, let's add that third day in there. I don't think that's the approach that I would take, and I think you probably want a reason to implement this on the microcycle level. From the tapering perspective, I really do think, similar to what you said, I've just had an overarching fantastic experience with that. I do think there needs to be a little bit of wiggle room. A couple considerations you've already mentioned, but I'll just reiterate them. My benchers, one of the first observations that put me down this path, and ultimately is kind of one of the first where my experience kind of dominates my application of these ideas, is that very often, I would set up somebody's microcycle where I expected their first bench session to be the strongest. And that was because it was followed by the most rest, or it was preceded by the most rest. So let's say they're training Monday through Friday, they have 2 days off on the weekend, and then they come in on Monday and have their kind of their main bench session. More than I would have expected, and it ultimately became a pattern in a few different people. That session was not the strongest, and it would actually be the second session where they bench that first day, and ultimately was a pretty heavy, high fatigue session. They would come in the next day and actually have a better performance if it was on a similar variation or whatever. So I saw that enough to start to take this idea seriously. There's definitely some people in some cases where actually there is a decay in something. You can call it technique decay, performance decay, something like that, where you're not ringing the bell enough for a muscle group or for a lift to allow that performance to be maximized. And the bench press was the first place that I saw this. So what I started to do on some of those individuals' tapers is I started to make those primer sessions become more and more similar to kind of a normal training session. And so I started to implement not only the kind of the ballistic low to moderate load stuff, but I'd also include one single at like 80% or something like that. And that's still honestly really easy. It's 7 reps in reserve for most people, a single at 80%. But for some, like you said, that can be just way too much, particularly squat and deadlift. It's a little bit of a different story, stuff like that. But I guess to me, coming back to kind of why would I implement one of these in a typical microcycle, that would be my reason. It's kind of balancing two things. Obviously, we talk about dose and individualizing dose all the time. That's the paramount thing that we need to get in kind of the right level for an individual to allow progress to occur, while also still allowing for recovery and aches and pains not to accumulate. If you're at a dose that you think is like pretty much what you can recover from, the dose is sufficient, and you don't really think that's the issue, but every time you get to that primary session after that first session it just seems like your technique doesn't feel appropriate. You don't feel prepared. Something about it just feels a little bit off. That's probably when I would implement one of these approaches, where I would just call that person somebody who has a high rate of technique decay. And I've seen that occasionally. I think you've mentioned this about your squat a few times, Josh, where if you take too long between those sessions, it just something feels wrong. It doesn't feel like that technique is as natural, I guess, is the way to talk about it there. And so that is the first kind of approach that comes to mind when you're implementing this on a typical microcycle. If you don't really think you need an increase in dose where you would increase volume or increase frequency, one of those more major higher level changes, this could be one of those strategies that could be a good middle ground to kind of implement first, and maybe is a permanent change if you find that kind of scratches the itch that you're looking for. So that to me is kind of from a practical perspective. I guess the first question is like, when are these strategies appropriate? On the microcycle level, what I just described for tapering, I think it's probably a pretty safe default strategy, although the actual configuration of how you set it up probably needs to vary per the individual.
Yeah. Um, to circle back to Infinity coming up, we've also expanded like the microcycle possibilities. And one of the big things that, again, when we designed the original system a couple years ago now, that I've changed my mind on, or I guess my thinking has developed on, if you will, is whether some folks kind of need to push the ball up the hill throughout the week, whereas other people you're pushing the ball down the hill or letting it roll down the hill. Some folks just do a lot better early in the week because typically if they're taking a day or two off on the weekend, they feel a little bit more fresh. Some people, they feel a little bit groggy and they almost feel better after the training week has accumulated and they feel better later in the week. So one of the questions on the individualization quiz within Infinity is, do you seem to do better with primary slots earlier or later in the week? And that just reflects kind of my thinking here. And ultimately, like you mentioned, for myself, there's always going to be that sweet spot for everyone, right? In terms of how many days from your last exposure feels best. For most people, for squat and deadlift, it's not the day after a difficult exposure, but also 8 days after, you're probably going to feel a little bit, groggy, or just it just doesn't kind of, it's not as quite as smooth. You're going to feel less practiced. In a primer session within a microcycle, if you keep it pretty light, right? If you kind of do the 30 to 60% range, that's literally just warming up, getting in the position, and you might feel a little bit better when you circle back around to it. I think where things get interesting within the microcycle is, when are we actually targeting kind of this primer approach or this potentiation approach versus when are we just kind of setting things up to feel the best on a certain day? And are those actually different? Because I very rarely am ever going to program, or at least in the past, I've very rarely going to program, again, like below 60%, because that's just so far away from any productive, skill stimulus or hypertrophy stimulus. And I typically just reserve that for a tapering primer session. But it sounds like your experience might be a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see what you're saying. Like, the question becomes like, is it just the fact that the sessions themselves are just so low of a recovery cost, you're not doing additional damage, or is it the fact that they're actually providing something? I would say, based on the evidence, it does seem to be the latter. It's just counterintuitive that you would think that would make a meaningful difference, but it does seem to.
Right.
It does seem to provide, measured in a variety of different ways, a pretty you know meaningful performance improvement for that little short period of time. And yeah, it's one of those things where the context obviously matters. We're talking with very experienced powerlifters, so it's going to be different than most of the people studied in this stuff. And that absolute load difference could mean something. That said, the one study that looked at the actual strength improvements, they were strong guys. They were really, really strong guys, which honestly the findings are pretty shocking to me. But that was enough for me to at least take it seriously, of like, okay, this is at least something I need to reconsider. And I just haven't experimented with kind of I would say, the slightly more aggressive approaches to actually try to elicit potentiation, if that makes sense. Like the way that I view it is like, there was a well documented effect of like if you do a single before AMRAPs, you're probably going to potentiate your repetition performance, right? The post activation potentiation. It's not a ton of reps usually, but it's generally a pretty consistent finding. I don't see why that wouldn't also be the case if you just remove it a little bit further, and be pretty conservative with the loading, and that kind of stuff. So it's something, as Josh said, I have not experimented with the more aggressive approaches of trying to elicit potentiation too much, with the exception of bench press. I've done this unknowingly quite a bit, I would say, but the I think the evidence is enough to warrant some experimentation. I can't say I would have a ton of confidence in saying do this. I've had a ton of experience with it, but I would say it changed my mind enough to say like, yeah, taking a single on a squat or a deadlift the day before you're trying to do something that's a high performance event may seem potentially counterintuitive, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that that could be a net positive effect once you kind of dial in some of the finer nuances of like, okay, what exactly is the loading range for this individual? How much does squatting beat them up, etc. And then the other thing would be the important thing about the ballistic stuff is that a lot of the time with like 30% of 1RM, we're talking jump squats, stuff like that. So it is truly like ballistic plyometric exercise a lot of the time. So that's important to keep in mind where that is not just simply warming up. It's like it is kind of a different stimulus in the way, because you're really pushing the intended velocity there to the extent that the barbell may come out of your hands on a bench press, or you may jump on a squat. We're not necessarily advocating for that, of course, but it's just important to keep in mind, like when we're looking to establish those effects, that's the type of intent that we're talking about, which I think it's like when you hear doing a couple sets of 5 with 30%, that's very different than what I think is actually established in the research, and I think that's important to keep in mind. So when we're talking like ballistic intent, I'm talking like literally as fast as you can. Probably not to the extent that you're doing a jump squat for most powerlifters. We don't want any accidents to happen, but really as fast as you possibly can. Viewing it less like technique practice there, because I honestly think that's why the high load thing could be so useful, is that actually gives you that opportunity, like you were talking about, to have a little bit of technique practice. You warm up to that, you get one really solid rep. It's right at that low end threshold of like, okay, this feels like real technique. Obviously it's not perfect, but it is kind of meeting the line there. And then the second half of it, if you were going to kind of combine these approaches with the lower load stuff, to me, that's almost, we're putting that almost entirely in kind of like the physiological bucket that we're kind of banking on, getting some mental reps in, like you said, Josh, visualization. I think that's where that kind of stuff comes in. Confidence is another big thing. I've heard a lot of lifters report like just doing that, feeling good, moving fast. Like the day before meet, I just went in feeling really confident, really prepared. So I think all those things are non-negligible effects that kind of paint the way that I think this stuff should be integrated. But I kind of was all over the place there. Go for it.
Yeah, I think my concern with implementing like these true potentiation, or sorry, primer sessions programmed kind of the way you outlined in the article is efficiency, in the sense that even if you're doing, ballistic sets, like you're saying, they should be taken seriously, and it takes some time to, get into position on the given lift, and that's time that could be spent doing other things. So up until this point, kind of the primer sessions, if you will, that I've landed on might be like a single at 5 to 6, followed by some doubles at 80% or some triples at 75% the day before a primary bench session, something like that. And I'm viewing that as, okay, this day is a little bit easier than a primary day, or like the secondary day within the week. This is maybe our third, fourth, fifth bench day of the week. So pretty low on the priority list, but it's still effective training. It's still contributing to kind of skill adaptations and or hypertrophy. And that's kind of how I've landed on primer sessions. I think that's probably the safest way to go. And just viewing it as like, okay, I'm going to set things up that lead to the individual feeling the best they can on their primary day. But on the other days, we also probably want to get productive training in. That's probably the most or I should say productive long-term training. And that's probably the safest way to go and the way we go the most times. And then these primer sessions are something you can have up your sleeve in cases that, you know, like you were saying, at what point do we actually prescribe these? Uh, I think if someone has issues tolerating uh, even a moderate frequency, you might want to throw these in, right? So if like, hey, if I squat anything over 70% more than twice a week, like it's game over for my knee, for example. Totally random example, but um, maybe that's a good candidate if things have stolen out from a recovery and recovery is kind of capped out. Maybe a primer session before the primary day is a trick to have up your sleeve. Um, I have fallen on things that kind of resemble these truly evidence based primer sessions when adding frequency, when kind of bridging someone. So I'll kind of slowly make that day harder, and it might start out really easy, maybe 60% early in a block for fives, right? And then slowly build that up until it becomes kind of a more stimulative, actually difficult session. So, but again, that's still with the kind of long term strength and hypertrophy stimulus in mind, as opposed to actually acutely improving neuromuscular performance for the next day or the day after that. So hopefully that was pretty useful for the listener in terms of take homes,
For
in
sure.
terms of what's safest versus what might be viewed more experimentally for the short versus long term.
Yeah, and this is one of the tangents I had on the list of things to potentially discuss that I didn't get a chance to touch on in the article. The efficiency thing is something I thought about when I was writing as well. And so the underlying premise in implementing one of these that is not super obvious to see but is there is basically what you're saying is that by implementing one of these primer sessions, the potentiation in my performance that I'm getting for my main session is going to result in better long-term progress than potentially sacrificing the acute performance for more work, more volume, whatever, that maybe actually harms your acute performance. That is definitely an assumption you're making that I'm not always sure is true and may not always be true in every case in either direction. So that was something I definitely considered because you're there's opportunity cost to implementing one of these strategies, even though the overall cost is low. And one of the most interesting things that I thought that the authors wrote about is they did talk about this a little bit. There's a table in the paper that kind of talks about long-term utilization of these strategies that I did think was interesting. And basically, in my mind, to justify the utility of them long term, particularly in the microcycle example, they would have to have some sort of additive adaptation that you would not be able to get from something else. Obviously, this is in the case of somebody who is already pretty confident that their dose is in a good spot, stuff like that. Taking some of the assumptions we mentioned earlier, but they mentioned some of the stuff like neuromuscular adaptations to like motor unit recruitment and stuff like that from repeatedly performing very, very ballistic contractions that I thought was at least interesting. And then, being able, we've talked about this before as kind of a speculative reason for some of the low fatigue stuff as well, of like just being able to achieve maximal performance, like true maximal performance relative to your, like if you were able to know how much your body could produce or how much your body could lift in a squat on a perfect day, being able to get closer to that number more often may potentially benefit strength and some of the neuromuscular adaptations associated with the kind of the ballistic stuff and repeatedly doing that they mentioned seem to kind of benefit that potentially. So I thought that was interesting in terms of kind of the longer term stuff because they did touch on, the long term integration of these strategies into training rather than just viewing it as kind of an acute thing. So I thought that was interesting. I don't really have well formed thoughts on it, but at least I think there's an argument you could make. I don't know if I agree with it entirely or even am strongly convinced of it, but I think there's at least an argument you could make that these types of sessions could have an adaptation that you're really not maximizing otherwise that could potentially benefit strength from other directions than kind of normal training, which I at least think is interesting, and kind of comes back to the whole DUP or very, very old school West Side. I know they've kind of changed the way that they use the dynamic effort method now, but kind of when it was true, kind of very fast velocity contractions with accommodating resistance, That's essentially what this is. Instead of using accommodating resistance, you're jumping off the ground with a loaded barbell, but it's essentially the same concept. And importantly, they would do those prior to their max effort sessions, a little bit farther away, 42 to 78 hours, but a similar concept. And they were doing those for higher volumes. So I kind of see, similarly, as always, Westside kind of had some of those principles kind of baked in there that I think are interesting to think about. So I also wonder if some of the low fatigue stuff that we've talked about and experimented with, some of this is baked in there as well. Kind of having that, if you're repeatedly priming yourself by pretty much always staying in kind of a lower proximity to failure, maybe that also has some potential benefits as well, and could explain some of our observations there. But that's just a shotgun of observations. So go ahead, try to tackle that.
Yeah, I think you meant to say 48 to 72 hours.
What
You
did I
can,
say?
I, I'd have to go back, and I'm very curious to go back and listen. I think you said 42 to 78 hours, but I'm
Nice.
not certain.
There you
So
go.
it's a little bit embarrassing if I'm wrong and you actually said it right, but
Comment 48 to 72, or sorry, comment 42 to
42 to 70.
78
Yeah.
hours if you made it this far.
Yeah. No, man. I mean, there might be something there because as we've talked about, you can probably achieve pretty high force production, or you almost certainly can achieve high force production. Just the duration at which you um, are exposed to that force production is going to be a lot less, and it's not going to be specific to a 1RM, but you are nonetheless able to produce high force. So there might be something there in terms of some sort of neuromuscular adaptations. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's a reason that kind of the power days are have been and to some degree still are a thing. Like maybe that is an aspect to strength that can kind of contribute to a 1RM slightly differently from a different angle, if you will, compared to kind of a traditional modern powerlifting type protocol. um, those are things I don't feel super confident saying are the case, but might be the case nonetheless. um, and I think from a practical perspective, the way I'd kind of work down the list is like at the end of the day, a lower priority session within the week, you have more flexibility. So, if it's your third squat day of the week, or for some people, maybe in their second squat day of the week, second deadlift day of the week, bench when you get to like 3, 4, 5, even 6 sessions per week, you kind of have to prioritize different sessions. And I think you should do that and kind of have that primary day throughout the week. And kind of a good standard starting point would just be, all right, let's make those protocols generally lower load. So lower percentage of 1RM, lower volume, and or higher RAR. There's a ton of ways to kind of go about that. That could be like kind of a true power session where the load is still decent, right? Say 80 to 85%, but it's very low volume and pretty dang high RAR if you're only doing singles or doubles for a few sets. And maybe you see a really good response, and that individual feels really good when they circle around to their primary day in 1, 2, 3 days. And cool, that's a great configuration for them. Other people, maybe they feel really good when they do, you know, uh, super high RAR for or sorry, I was super high RAR but a decent amount of volume. Maybe they seem to grow pretty well when they have sets of 8 in there that are kind of in that 4 to 6 RAR range. Maybe that's a really good protocol for them. And then you can kind of continue to work down that, and you might even find yourself in one of these true primer sessions. And again, I would have to believe that would be more common with higher frequencies. So once you start to get 3+ for squat, 2+ for deadlift, 4+ for bench press, you might find yourself in these true primer sessions using potentially ballistic intent, doing just one single in that 75 to 85% range. And I think that's a really interesting way to kind of think about these lower priority days that are still important because they influence the primary days and are going to contribute potentially acutely to your upcoming performances. And that could lead to potentially better long term performances as a result. And that volume and those exposures might have adaptations, like we were just talking about, ability to maximally recruit motor units. If you're doing sets of 8 at 4 to 6 RER, is that an optimal hypertrophy stimulus? No, but it's something, and that can add up if it's within kind of your recovery bounds, that sort of thing. And then, you know, that hopefully what I just went over for the last couple minutes is a nice framework for experimentation within those lower priority sessions, to ultimately set up the best performances for the primary sessions and the best progress throughout a block or a training cycle.
All right, that was great. Last tangent, because we've talked about this a couple times, and I think we're visiting it with a new perspective now. After we, I think if you recall, after one of the frequency studies recently came out, we've kind of slightly revisit our position about kind of performance for hypertrophy and how much that matters. Um, so, you know, these priming sessions to some degree have kind of in them the whole conversation around post activation potentiation, which very simply just means, from a practical perspective, let's say you're doing 4 sets of 8, or actually let's say you're doing 4 sets to failure. Let's just say that you do a single at 90% before you do 4 sets to failure. That post activation potentiation would probably suggest that if you do that single before those sets to failure, you'll get more total repetitions. It's kind of a acute, very acute increase in performance that comes from some sort of high load exposure generally. Kind of revisiting that, Josh, with maybe slightly different perspective than when we used to think about it. Do you think that is a useful strategy, particularly for muscle growth? So if you had somebody who is, almost entirely physique focused, is it ever a good idea to include a single with a high load to kind of in a different way kind of prime them, whether that's for performance reasons, and there's just generally just seems to be a benefit from performance for hypertrophy, let's say, if you think that. Two, again, maybe there's some sort of benefit from these priming sessions over the long term in terms of more efficient motor unit recruitment, or you're able to get more hypertrophy out of sets farther from failure, or maybe just more hypertrophy overall. There's a ton of different speculations you could make depending on kind of how you want to take it. But I know we've clashed on this opinion in the past, just talking on it. I'm curious where you kind of think about that now.
The first thing I'd say is I do get a little bit skeptical about like a top single improving performance as much as it has in the research. Not saying that like any of the research is wrong or anything. Maybe it's just a matter of these specific protocols used and or the population. So that's the first thing I'd say, right? Like if someone's doing high bar squats, that's pretty well trained for primarily for hypertrophy. I'm not going to have them do a single if strength isn't part of their goals, but maybe more interestingly is like do a top set of 4 to 6 and then back off sets of 6 to 10. And if that top set of 4 to 6, let's just say it does improve performance for those back off sets of, what did I say, 6 to 10, whatever the case is, that are lower load, would that lead to more hypertrophy? I have no clue. I don't see why it would be bad though. And if you can configure things to the point where that first set is still efficient for hypertrophy, like a set of 4 to 6 is still going to be more or less a really good set for hypertrophy. And you could bump that up. Maybe you go 5 to 7 to make dang sure you're being maximally efficient on a per set basis. And that potentiates performance a little bit for the back off, and you're not really adding session time or adding recovery cost. I don't see a downside. I see that if you configure it properly, or not properly, but I guess cautiously maybe is a better word. If you configure it cautiously, you could be stacking the chips in your favor in terms of also making the back offs a little bit more productive. And then you start thinking about a recent podcast and newsletter we did about exposure to various rep ranges, which might be beneficial in and of itself. So that's my current position. I used to be really on board and excited about a heavy exposure improving performance and that leading to more hypertrophy. I think you pulled me down from that. I've kind of climbed back up that mountain a little bit as a result of some of the stuff we've talked about recently in terms of performance potentially mattering for hypertrophy. We did a podcast about frequency where I think we really started to think about that a little bit more. So I'm a little bit back on board with it, but still not like going out of my way to reduce training efficiency, add session time in the name of acute potentiation for hypertrophy.
You said basically exactly what I was going to say. I think in theory it would, but the reality is the performance benefits, at least, you know, like if we were to do this protocol that we'd see from doing that, I don't think justify the all the logistics that go into it, right? Like a, you know, 1 to 2 rep improvement, even theoretically, which even like you said, based on our experience, maybe isn't even consistent, then it becomes less of an advantage, right? Like if you're telling me there's an approach I could take that's mildly inconvenient, maybe takes an additional 10 minutes that doubles the amount of, you know, volume I could do, obviously that's going to benefit hypertrophy. So that concept is true, but the reality of the performance improvements that we see from the research that shows PAP does happen is still very modest. And then you layer our personal experience on top of that of like, are you really getting that many more reps if you do a really hard set before, you know, 4 sets to a really high RIR? Probably not. You're not going to get a ton more out of that. All those things kind of considered is like theoretically it'd be great, but in reality it doesn't seem to benefit overall performance of a session that much. So even you could be pro like PAP and suggest that that would be beneficial for hypertrophy, but the magnitude of the effect that would have to change in terms of the performance of the back off sets would have to be higher for it to even be expected to make a meaningful change, I guess is the way that I view it.
Yeah, this just reminds me of my nihilism regarding proximity to failure and proximity to failure recommendations as well. Because I think about all the research we have where in the same exact context, but you just change one variable. So whether that's doing a single beforehand for post-activation potentiation, whether it's a music preference, whether it's presence of spotters, things like that, that like you wouldn't necessarily expect to influence the stimulus of the next set, influences your performance for a set, and thus like an RP8 in one context isn't always an RP8 type of thing. If that kind of makes some
Like
degree of sense.
your max, even though it sounds weird, like your maximum attainable
Yeah.
like squat in condition A
Like
is literally different than condition
how
B.
can we talk about proximity to failure when the endpoint, i.e., failure, is a moving target based on these variables, right? And maybe it is that like I think we would both hold the position that like proximity to failure does matter at least to some extent for hypertrophy. If we assume that to be the case, maybe you want to do all you can to maximize performance, question mark, or maybe you want to do things such as PAP so that the earlier reps have a little bit more a little bit more motor unit recruitment, to be very vague, early on in the set, and thus things are even more stimulative or more productive or more effective early in a set. I don't know, but I think that kind of goes back to our reluctance to recommend specific RIRs because of all these kind of moving parts within that failure endpoint actually being what we think it is.
Yep. Yeah. No, I'm with you, man. That's all I got, man. You got anything else?
No, that's it. Appreciate you guys making it to this point. If you did, we'll see you for episode 55.
Thanks, everybody.